Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy's new webinar series entitled Scrubbing the Skies, the Role of Carbon Dioxide Removal in Combating Climate Change. I'm the series host, Wil Burns, and I'm a visiting professor at Northwestern University's Environmental Policy and Culture program. In the past few years, there's been increasing emphasis on the need to ensure that principles of environmental justice play an integral role in carbon dioxide removal research and deployment programs and projects. However, these discussions have often been vague as to how to operationalize this objective. Today's guests, Selena Scott Buchler in the Climate Innovation Program at Data for Progress, and Dr. Simone Stewart in the Climate and Energy Program of the National Wildlife Federation, have completed a new study that could provide a foundation for ensuring that environmental justice considerations are front and center in the U.S. government's planning for 4 direct air capture hubs. The report is entitled Charting a Path to Just Direct Air Capture Hubs. So at the outset, I'm going to invite Selena and Simone to summarize the key findings and recommendations of the report, and then we'll move on to a Q&A session. Selena, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having us. We have a pretty similar opening slide here, so maybe I'll just kick it over to Simone to get us started.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Will, that was a great introduction. I'm Simone Stewart at the National Wildlife Federation, as my colleague Selena said. And before we actually get into what we discuss a lot in the memo, I really want to start with a level-setting conversation around defining what environmental justice is. And so this is actually a little bit of a difficult task because there is no universal recognized definition of environmental justice. So it's a little bit paradoxical that I say that we're going to talk about defining it, and then I tell you that there is no definition. But that's kind of just one of the social issues that we have to grapple with. And even though there's no one way to define environmental justice, there are principles and tenets that we can direct ourselves towards as we try to have this conversation. And so one of the definitions that a lot of people in our sector use to discuss environmental justice is the US EPA definition. And so I have that here on the screen as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. I would like to just point out that this definition, while a lot of people in the sector working in CDR are familiar with this definition and often use this definition for environmental justice, I'd like to point out that regardless, I think that a lot of times different communities have qualms with the fact that the word regardless is used because it seems like everything that comes after that is maybe less important. So even though you are one of these categories, your opinion should still count, is sort of how it sounds. So I'd like to point us, as we talk about the principles around environmental justice to looking at the image that I have here on the screen, which were the 17 principles of environmental justice, which were created in 1991 at the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. So environmental leaders from all over the United States came together and had a conference in DC in 1991. And this is where the principles of environmental justice were founded. And a lot of environmental justice organizations and advocates use these principles today to still talk about how environmental justice should be enacted in all of the work that we're trying to do to move towards a green energy economy. And so I actually prefer this definition from Dr. Bunyan Bryant, who is an EJ pioneer and advocate and also a native of Flint, Michigan. And I'd like to direct your attention to the bolded part where he says environmental justice is served when people can realize their highest potential. And I think that the potential point is what we would really like to focus on today, because the DAC hubs are a huge point of potential for charting the pathway into the CDR sector, for charting a just pathway into a green economy. And so I really think that we should focus on a high potential point today. And he continues to say where both cultural and biologic diversity are respected and highly revered, and where justice prevails. it's really important to discuss environmental justice in the context of all of the kinds of conversations that we're having around this kind of energy economy. But it's really important to realize that we don't just talk about environmental justice because it is a box to check, but because environmental justice exists because environmental injustice exists, that injustice exists in society. So I frequently tell people, you have to be comfortable with the idea that unjust structures exist and are perpetuated throughout all aspects of our society. Because in order to foster this work and advocate for communities that need their voices to be heard, all of this is inherent to combating the climate crisis, and inherent to that is understanding, acknowledging, and recognizing that injustice occurs. And so the climate crisis is a threat multiplier. And this is why we talk about environmental injustice, because a threat multiplier is exactly what it sounds like. If you exist already in a disenfranchised and marginalized status in society, the climate crisis is going to disproportionately affect you. And so we want to think about bringing these vulnerable groups with us as we chart this future towards a net zero society. So it's important for us to think about questions like, where does injustice come from? What causes it? Who and or what perpetuates it, and who benefits from it? Because we really have to tackle the crux of injustice existing in order to chart a pathway towards thinking about how to justly create a future. And so I just have a couple of groups listed in the United States that are most vulnerable to the climate crisis. This includes low income, socioeconomic status, elderly people, women, girls, and ethnic minorities. And so I've kind of laid the groundwork for why we are talking about the DAC hubs in the context of environmental justice. And I'll throw it to Selena to talk a little bit more about the DAC hubs themselves.
Yeah, thanks, Simone. So I imagine that folks on this webinar probably already know this, but as we are defining our terms, it's important to understand kind of what we are talking about. So even DOE has some ambiguity around what exactly the direct air capture hubs cover, but for the purposes of this webinar, we'll be talking about direct air capture, an infrastructure-based method of pulling past emissions out of the atmosphere via a filter. And again, there are lots of other ways that are popping up in order to accomplish this. And we're talking about carbon dioxide removal. So we're talking about CO2 being stored for long periods of time, meant to be permanent. This differentiates it from kind of shorter term uses like DAC to fuels, things like that, that are going to potentially be important tools in other sectors, but do not constitute carbon dioxide removal because there isn't that kind of permanence. And so that as we're talking about DAC, we have, go to the next slide. So we at Data for Progress do a lot of work on sort of, public opinion and increasingly community perceptions around climate innovation. And so we kind of, asked, all right, even as we're having these discussions in more knowledgeable communities around kind of what direct air capture is, what does the public know about it, and what do they think about it when presented with information? And so, as is probably unsurprising to most folks on this call, there is very low knowledge of what direct air capture or CDR is. When presented with a brief overview of what legislation exists to potentially advance CDR, there is high levels of bipartisan support, and that is quite different from most climate policies that we poll at Data for Progress. And so this would indicate to us that while the public is broadly unaware of sort of what these technologies are, that they are at least kind of open to having this discussion, though ultimately the opposition or support will be very sort of site specific. And so when we're looking at kind of, policy support among the public, this is following policy support among policymakers. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, passed at the end of 2021, created 4 regional direct air capture hubs of $3.5 billion total. There was a pre-commercial prize competition of $15 million, a commercial prize competition of $100 million, and then a carve out for figuring out the transportation and storage of CO2 between different projects, both that already exist and those that will be coming online soon. And then more recently, the Inflation Reduction Act had bump ups for the 45Q tax credit, which has been one of the most important forms of policy support for direct air capture in the US, increasing the tax credit to $180 per ton for permanent geologic storage, and slightly lower rates than for utilization and enhanced oil recovery. And for this first line up here, the 4 regional DAC hubs, Congress had a couple criteria for what DOE should prioritize in its siting of these hubs. And they said, we want there to be a match between economic need and economic opportunity. So where are there places that workforces have traditionally relied on carbon intensive infrastructure and industry for their livelihoods? Where are then there, potentially economic opportunity zones, a IRS classification that identifies areas that need kind of reinvestment? And of course, where are there viable CO2 storage opportunities? And so this great map, or these 2 great maps, were produced by Carbon 180 that overlaid all of these various criteria to identify which parts of the country may potentially see these kinds of applications put in. And so at Data for Progress, we wanted to know, there are all of these various configurations of what DAC might look like. And of course, as I was saying earlier, it's interesting to know what the public at large thinks about direct air capture and CDR broadly, but it's more interesting to know what they think about DAC and CDR when it's going to potentially be in their community. So how do we ask more targeted questions, not just about what do you think about this in the abstract, but when it's a real possibility? And so we ran a conjoint survey to try and understand what are the aspects of direct air capture that will sway communities to either support or potentially oppose DAC development in their communities. And we found that even though the funding is already set aside, that the source of the funding was the most important part to folks. And so the way that we sort of tested not just what do people want to have come out of this process, but also which are the factors that are most important. We ran a slightly different kind of survey called a conjoint survey that presents 2 different policy packages that has randomly generated variables for each of these categories: funding source, developer and owner, energy source, et cetera, in order to kind of determine it. And that's how we found that the funding source was the most important variable in determining support for a direct air capture hub in one's community or general area. And that folks generally wanted that to be a tax on pollutive industries, a kind of, a fairness question of, well, if, it's CO2 that is created by pollutive industries, then, there should be a funding mechanism. And so obviously this doesn't apply to IIJA because that funding has already been set aside, but it's interesting to see what this might mean for DAC moving forward. The kinds of things that DOE can be thinking about in terms of its application granting. The potential for job creation was a very close second in what folks thought was really important in a project. And with the highest support for long-term local jobs guarantees with a unionization commitment, a slight bump for that unionization commitment as opposed to, long-term jobs guarantee, but without a unionization commitment. Share of project costs that were going to be invested through something like a community benefit agreement or project labor agreement, or various other kind of legally binding agreements that developers can enter into with communities in order to create something that's mutually beneficial. Community involvement was going to be really important. And so if we look at kind of the optimal package, and this is obviously different depending on where you go in the country, but sort of our national results were a tax on pollutive industry, cooperatively owned, and increasingly we're starting to look at kind of a publicly owned model using new or expanded wind and solar energy, with direct voting power from communities, not just in the process of sort of, laying out the project, but in an ongoing way, transported out of the community. And there was no statistical difference between pipeline versus, trucks and rail, but just generally we're interested in kind of seeing it moved out with the highest level of cost reinvestment. And then again, those local jobs with unionization. And so essentially what we're trying to kind of lay out here for DOE is a new approach to infrastructure siting. Usually project planning looks a lot like this. If you identify the site where you want to build, you move forward with a permitting process in order to build there. As you're waiting the months or potentially years for that permitting process to go through, you're designing the project, then maybe in the later stages, consulting the community, especially if the permitting process requires that of a project developer. And then in the very latest stages of development, hiring the workforce in order to staff the project once it's on the ground. And so instead, we're kind of looking at a conceptual approach to project planning that looks like this. So identifying multiple sites where there is the geophysical viability and access to energy and all of the other things that you need for a project to be successful technologically, beginning to consult the communities that live there to understand if this is a project that they're interested in at all, and if so, how could we co-design it such that it meets community needs while also meeting the developer's needs for the technology. Cooperatively then building the workforce. We've been doing listening sessions around the country and have heard that even when projects want to hire locally, if they haven't done the training alongside the consultation and design process, that often those requisite skill sets then don't exist within the community. And so those jobs then necessarily have to go to folks from outside the community. And so kind of, iteratively going through these stages and then leading up to the permitting process at the very end. So kick it over to Simone for this on do's and don'ts of deploying DAC.
Yeah, so I guess we each kind of had our part where we talked about the importance of environmental justice being ingrained in the work that we're doing, especially building up this newer sector. And Selena did a great job of laying the groundwork of the policy moment that we're in, that is galvanized by billions of dollars. And so we kind of combined these two perspectives and talked a lot about the do's and don'ts of deploying DAC. So really straightforward, the deployment of DAC should not. So these were the things that we felt like should be avoided, or DOE should actively think about as recommendations to avoid. And the first top line item was perpetuating environmental injustices. So there's recognition that these injustices already exist, and with the statute that Congress delivered, that some of these projects have to exist or should exist in economically disenfranchised communities, with the hope of eventually, if done correctly, if implemented correctly, then it can enfranchise that community and build the local economy. But in that recognition, we want to make sure that we're not perpetuating any injustices that already exist. So we discussed the consideration of free, prior, informed consent, the principles of EJ, using comprehensive screening tools to identify the communities that could serve to host these projects, and really a baseline kind of thing that seems very obvious is rejecting proposals that don't have any plans for community engagement, because we want to make sure that not only are these communities okay with hosting a DAC hub or any kind of project, but that they're excited and that they want to participate in the process. And so this also includes not assuming that communities are interested in hosting DAC. A lot of times when we talk about DAC projects, we talk a lot about that job and workforce component that Selena just discussed, but that's not the only benefit that DAC has the potential to bring to communities. And so being really transparent and clear about what DAC can offer to communities and making sure that there is genuine interest from the community is really important. Additionally, we said that DAC deployment should not perpetuate fossil fuel use. And so this is also kind of wrapped up in the previous statute of perpetuating environmental injustices, because many of these injustices have been perpetuated by the fossil energy industry. And communities are very much aware of this. There is a multi-generational kind of trauma that exists in a lot of environmental justice communities, even those that were economically benefiting from the fossil industry who are now in transition. And so it's really important, we feel, for DOE in the hub's conversation to commit to using zero carbon energy sources, so DAC truly can be a net negative technology, and deprioritizing projects that provide CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. And a multi-round development track for innovation is really important. There are a lot of players in the CDR arena now. As the sector is building out, we're seeing more investment from the private sector getting involved, the creation of startups also happening. And so a lot of the incumbent actors that are transitioning from fossil energy or maybe funded by fossil energy are likely to dominate these processes because they are the ones with very advanced technology or the ability to deploy things quickly. But we don't want DOE to lose sight of the potential for innovation in the CDR field and for the hubs to be a center for that. So now talking about what DAC should do, our recommendations start kind of in the same place with aligning with the President's Justice 40 initiatives. So the DAC Hubs program, along with other DAC programs under DOE, are all covered programs by Justice 40. And so this initiative, which was part of an executive order on climate, states that 40% of federal investments in climate and energy should flow to disadvantaged communities. And so when we talk about the benefit of getting those investments, it's really important for developers to consult with communities to assess what a benefit truly is to them. Selena pointed out in their conjoint survey that DFP did that we already have all of this funding set aside for the DAC hubs, but when people were asked, they felt like the funding should be coming from a tax on pollutive industries. So if you're not asking communities what they want and having them participate in shaping the project, you may miss the mark on what you think you're delivering. And so it's also really important to employ tools that already exist, like the EPA's EJ screen and CEQ's Climate Economic Justice Screening tool to identify these communities once again, and develop equity-centered program models. In line with this initiative, prioritizing community needs is very high level. So communities, as Selena said, should be a part of the way that we consider siting, design, decision-making. They should be stakeholders that are engaged early and throughout the process. And this includes the right to refusal. If a community doesn't want DAC where they are, companies should respect that. And we really encourage DOE to be vocal about this as well as they're leading this charge. We talk about community benefit agreements and project labor agreements in our memo, where, you know, communities want to co-create. They want to be a part of the project and design of what's happening in their community because they know their community the best. As a person who has a science background and works for a nonprofit entity that really prioritizes people and wildlife conservation, I often find that there's grappling between the expertise of science and the expertise of people and what they know from their lived experiences. And historically, we've said that expertise in science trumps the lived experience of people. And that is how environmental injustice often becomes pervasive. And so we have to say that communities have their own experts. They're experts in what's best for their communities. And so working together with the science, working together with companies to deploy these projects correctly is recognizing these equal levels of expertise. And so sometimes that looks like developing a path toward cooperative or community ownership, so stakeholders from the community feel like they're a part of the project. And it definitely includes things like listening sessions and public engagement, a lot of which is being done by third parties like DFP and like NWF. And lastly, the two qualities that we also said as recommendations for DOE are that we should value quality over expediency. This is a conversation that comes up a lot, and I think it is a little bit of $1 million question when there is money that has to be pushed out the door, especially on a certain timeline. There is a desire also with the climate crisis that we're already experiencing, especially these disadvantaged communities, to be quick about what we do. But just because there is a timeline that we have to work on doesn't mean that we can't respect the values and lived experiences of people in these communities who are expecting quality and expecting to reap the benefits of these projects. So the hubs are the first of their kind, that have government funding has been allotted towards, and they will continue to be highly scrutinized. So there is a real opportunity, as I stated in the very beginning when talking about the definitions of environmental justice, there is high potential here. So we want to capitalize on the high potential for the hubs to do great for climate change, but we also want to capitalize on the potential of what the DAC hubs can do for communities. And this is really something that we think should be powered by non-fossil energy. Of course, this is paired with high quality MRV, transparent communication about that monitoring and verification, and plans with communities if things go wrong. And of course, to truly be negative, we want this linked with permanent geologic storage to be, to really be removing the CO2. And really in Congress clarifying the role of DAC, there's a lot of conversation about definitions. What is DAC? What is a hub? And what that looks like. By Congress clarifying that, and by extension CDR, we'll understand the role that CDR can play as a solution in a suite of solutions to combat the climate crisis. And so this should not take priority over other mitigation tactics, over decarbonization. We still have to do what we can and hold industries that are emitters responsible while keeping our sights set on this potential for the future. So I'll throw it back to Selena to wrap us up.
Yeah, thank you. So as we've been laying out, we are at a critical point for climate. The recent IPCC report has emphasized what many of us have already seen the writing on the walls for, that CDR is increasingly necessary alongside deep and really committed decarbonization. As DOE is considering the project applications for DAC hub funding, DAC being a relatively new piece of the climate action puzzle, it will be crucial that the agency center equitable deployment of new infrastructure in ways that rewrite and unwrite the role of the fossil fuel industry, and most importantly, meets the needs of communities that are most vulnerable to the climate crisis and that have borne the brunt of climate and infrastructure and industry in the past. We should want justice as much as we want carbon dioxide removal, probably more, and deliver on both. And so this is an opportunity to get DAC right and to set a really, really high bar for what DAC looks like moving forward. And so we're really recommending and pushing for high quality, both technologically, but also socially, economically, over expediency. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Selena and Simone, for that overview. I think that is a good start as we move to questions and try to get into some of the specific aspects of your recommendations and some of the implications. And I'll take the privilege of the host and ask you the first question, and then we have a large number of good questions in the from the audience. So the question I'd ask you is, the environmental justice community, when they talk about environmental justice aspects, obviously one question is ensuring that there's not disproportionate negative impacts of a project when it might be cited in their community, right? And you spend a lot of time looking at how we can avoid that, right? Especially, the radical concept of actually having consultation at the outset, as opposed to actually after the permitting has begun and the groundbreaking has begun. I was on a call with a direct air capture company I won't name this last week, and they had already broken ground and they were getting ready for the listening tour, right? And it feels very artificial, because it is, right? So I think that's helpful. But the other thing that the EJ community often argues is that what DACs and other CDR approaches can do is allow the good times to roll for the fossil fuel industry by allowing offsets, for example, and those communities then still having all of the negative other impacts of fossil fuel development associated with other pollutants visited upon them for longer, right? And you suggest at one point in the report that Congress, for example, established parallel mandates and things of that sort. But the reality is, right now in the US, we don't have federal climate policy, right? And so a lot of this is being driven by the voluntary markets, and they may view direct air capture as a way to meet those net zero commitments in a way that doesn't reduce fossil fuels as much as we'd want, right? And I think a lot of the people in the EJ community are most concerned about that. How do you think we could address that in the voluntary markets at this point? Does it require actual federal involvement? What do you think? I'll let either one of you start.
Yeah, most proximately, any federal funds that are allocated to CDR development should not be going to fossil fuel companies or their subsidiaries. That is like a very, the lowest hanging fruit in terms of this conversation. In terms of private funds that are being moved, similarly, I think that there's a lot that purchasers can do in order to kind of look at the full supply chain of the credits that they are purchasing and ask, is this continuing to perpetuate fossil fuel use, and not just sort of, fossil fuel use itself, but also like the power of the fossil fuel industry that then ends up popping up in climate policy conversations at state and federal levels. And so there is a lot that can happen through sort of voluntary actions and sort of an alignment of the space against sort of, common greenwashing actors. And also, I think we need to be pushing for federal guardrails that ensure that it isn't up to private actors to decide what good CDR looks like and what is not.
Yeah, I think that last point is critical, because I'm skeptical that if we leave it to the private sector, they're going to do that, right? Because if it turns out to be a fairly inexpensive route, ultimately, it certainly isn't now, but if direct air capture is a fairly inexpensive route, I don't see why they're going to say, well, let's wring out the more expensive ways to decarbonize first and then move to that, right? I could see them moving quickly to DAC and extending the lifetime of the industry, right? Which should peel off a lot of support, I think, in the EJ communities, legitimately, probably. Simone?
I think, yeah, that part of it is, we can't expect the private sector to regulate itself. So from that, we need robust and rigorous guardrails coming from the federal government, and we need robust federal climate policy. I think some of the issues of the sustaining of the fossil fuel industry could, be abated if we had a domestic carbon price, and people were able to use more than just 45Q to be paid for the storage component of it. We see the boom in EOR and fossil fuel companies working in DAC because I know how much a gallon of oil costs, and there's profit in that. And so I think part of it is, creating a market around carbon. But I also think, and this is what DOE really has an opportunity to do, is to set the groundwork for transparency, because the offsets conversation is one that is continually happening in the private sector. And if the federal government is setting the groundwork for really robust, transparent MRV in terms of, monitoring, reporting, verification of what is happening to that CO2, then I think that creates a standard that the private sector has to follow in order to be considered as robust as what the federal government is doing. I also think that, in a world that is becoming increasingly more globalized and where, the opinion of everyday people kind of carries a different weight than maybe it did 20, 30, even 10 years ago. I think that there is a social currency also that companies, especially newer startup companies, are more concerned about than incumbent actors that maybe have a very clear history. When you're starting from the groundwork in a globalized world where someone can easily, especially with $8 now to get a verified check on Twitter, say anything they want about your company, I think that companies now, especially the new startups, are really hoping to utilize that social currency to become the new version of the incumbents, to say we're being held accountable by society to do things correctly. And that is what is motivating us to be transparent about what we're doing, about where the CO2 is going when we're done capturing it. And I think with that combined, hopefully with the progression towards robust climate policy, we can create a pathway towards not perpetuating previous harms.
All right. Thanks to both of you for that. Okay, I'm going to move into audience questions. As I indicated, there's an abundance. The first question is, who is or will be in charge of the consultative process, government or private firms?
Yeah, so DOE has set a requirement for community benefit plans. And so what that means is that in any application, the developer is required to set forward a plan for what they will do to consult communities and how they will then, work to kind of negotiate with communities. While we think that that's really important, Data for Progress as a nonprofit, philanthropically funded organization is trying to get a head start on some of that consultation, because it's a very different kind of conversation when you're having it with the developer that wants to set up a project in your community, as opposed to a group that, doesn't really have a stake in sort of where this funding goes, just wants to make sure that it is aligned with community needs and desires. And so, and I have also seen other groups starting to kind of do a lot of this work. And so I would say that officially, it'll be the developers that are required to do this. DOE, I think, is also starting to do some of its own listening sessions, and it is also happening in the public sector. So it's a bit of a mishmash of all of the above.
Anything to add, Simone? Okay. All right. Next question. Regarding the perpetuation of past and present injustices, does a focus on environmental justice mean that a just use of DAC will generally be suspicious of any focus of private for-profit companies as innovation drivers? EJ seems to have ends and values which are in tension with some economic presuppositions made by corporate involvement in DAC innovation. There's a hefty question for
Yeah,
you.
yeah. I think this is a good question. And I think it echoes a little bit of what we were getting at before. I think it's really important to ask who the actors are. I think it really depends on company, especially as newer companies are starting to crop up that are, I think a lot of them are trying to build these values into their company because they recognize, because of this social currency, that EJ is now this kind of conversation that, for better or worse, you can't get around. They're building in this kind of idea about how to consult communities and how DAC is supposed to bring benefits to communities. So I think that EJ and the economic kind of mechanisms for DAC don't necessarily have to be in tension with each other. I think oftentimes they are, but I think when going back to that past and present harm, it's about which actors have caused that. I think if you are a fossil energy type of company that is interested in DAC, it is impossible for you to engage with communities about DAC without recognizing the previous harm that's been caused by fossil energy work that your company has done. Whereas I think some of the newer and more innovative companies that are only really about DAC and are not subsidiaries or fossil energy companies that have undergone changes, have a clean slate to start. And I think that is a really high potential opportunity for them to be building the tenets of environmental justice into their frameworks. Of course, in a capitalist society, a profit has to be made, but definitely thinking about where the harms are going to be placed is really important in the work that these newer companies will set out doing. And I believe that there are ways for them to do the work and make a profit, but also do that not at the expense of the community.
Could I tease that one thing out there? So
Yeah,
you're
yeah, of
talking
course.
about newer companies, right?
Mhm.
And startups. But the reality is that, for example, the
Yeah,
largest first DAC project, right, is going to be Occidental Petroleum
right,
and Carbon Engineering's project, which will generate 100 times more credit than all of the 18 DAC facilities combined, right?
right,
And so you're going to start off with an oil company.
right.
And you indicate that in those cases, there needs to be an acknowledgement of the past harms that have been visited on the community. What does that look like in a practical sense in terms of your consultative approach and then implementation of the project?
Yeah, I think what it looks like is definitely depending on where you are. So the project that you're talking about, 1.5, is going to be in West Texas, and they're preparing to break ground for that. So it's already kind of what you were alluding to earlier in your statement, that you're breaking ground already, and have you talked with communities that are there? And I think that we use Occidental as an example because they are, as you said, the first kind of their kind in the domestic context that are doing this work. I think from my perspective, it looks like hiring consultants that are from the communities that you're having conversations with. I think it means bringing labor actors, especially because the fossil industry has a lot of transferable skill sets. And I think Selena alluded to this in her conversation about labor, where, you can have those jobs that are moving from the oil and gas sector into the DAC sector. But if you are not providing any incentive or training apprenticeship to take those jobs that maybe even were for Occidental in other places, and having people work intentionally to transfer that capability, that's an opportunity to recognize, well, there's economic value that we want to provide as a company that has, had past harms in this particular area. I think acknowledgement of those past harms, naming those past harms in communities, and what I think ultimately people want to see is companies putting their money where their mouth is. So if you're making a profit off of this, which they will, and are most likely to use at least some of the captured carbon from that in enhanced oil recovery to continue gaining a profit, that profit has to be injected back into that community. But I think fundamentally it is going to be one of those situations that is at odds, because what EJ communities have communicated, to us third-party NGOs and these conversations that Selena has alluded to, is that an extractive industry is an extractive industry. So as long as you are still extracting, whether you choose to call the oil net zero oil or, whatever type of way that you brand the extraction, even if it is less carbon intensive technically than the other types of ways that you've extracted oil, EJ communities don't want anything to do with a company that is actively extracting, because they feel as though you cannot actively extract in the present and acknowledge the past and acknowledge the harm. You can't be doing both at the same time. And so I think that's really the perspective that these companies have to understand, that if you are not recognizing that, you will always be in tension with EJ communities and you will always be at odds with them. And there is unlikely any way to get them. And I don't think that they should have to support your project or support what you're doing if you are actively extracting with one hand and then saying, I'm acknowledging the past and I'm acknowledging harm, because you're creating harm in the present.
Okay, anything to add, Selena?
Yeah, I want to touch on this question about scale, right? We look at the scale of CDR that we're going to need by the end of the century. And the good news is that we're starting early, right? We need the vast majority of CDR potential 2050 onward. And so that we are starting now in the 2020s is a good thing. And it also means that this kind of artificial pressure to get it to the gigaton scale tomorrow is just that. It's artificial. Are the oil and gas industry incumbents those that have the technology to do this at the largest scale today? Yes, absolutely. Do we need it at the largest scale today? No, absolutely not. And so what federal funds and what other, even in the private sector should be prioritizing is ethical, equitable scale up of a technology that we want to see have its prime time in the latter half of the 21st century. And if we don't put our money into those actors, then they're not going to be able to scale to the 1 million ton threshold. And if you combine their technology, like many of the smaller startups that are creating really, really great non-fossil dependent, independent technologies to be able to remove carbon from the atmosphere, you ban all of them together and they're able to meet that threshold, right? No one of them is able to on their own, but there is power in having a large set of actors that are trying to do this right and that are not the oil and gas companies. So I don't think that that is kind of something that we have to accept. That's really something that we need to question. And also even the scale of CDR 2050 through 2100, that can be anywhere from a couple gigatons to several hundred gigatons. And what we assume about what we're going to need then does also influence our actions today and through 2050 on decarbonization. And so I would say that we should be shooting for low levels of CDR, because that means that we are doubling down on our commitment to high levels of decarbonization.
I also think, building on top of that, when people say, oh, well, you recognize that the fossil industry are the ones that have the technology now, so are you saying you don't want basically what Selena was saying? I think part of it is we have to understand that there's a reason why the fossil industry has the capability, technology, capital value to build at this level. And it's because they are building on a foundation of the past harm that they've caused. And so that definitely has to be recognized. And I think that in this creation of a hub, a true hub where you have multiple parts of a puzzle coming together, and you have that innovation growing, I think that, this is a great model for the future, because you prevent a monopoly from developing in the future. Because if we continue to reward the incumbent actors, they only gain more capital to continue controlling the sector. And so I think, when we break the capital up across different companies, you prevent any one of them from becoming too powerful. And in that case, that power can often lead to injustice. And so, as we've seen with the fossil energy community. So I think that the CDR sector trying to start from scratch and leave the legacy of past injustices behind, recognizing this as an opportunity to use CDR to right past wrongs and to start in a positive framework, that we're doing this even economically in a way that is really powerful by preventing there from even being a monopoly of CDR in the future.
All right. Thank you very much for that. I'll move on to the next question. There's a suggestion or a question, first of all, are there particular types of storage targeted within the DOE objective? And the concern of the questioner is that some of the storage might ultimately be effectuated offshore and potentially avoid some of the consultative processes that you talked about. Is that a possibility in terms of the federal program?
Doing anything offshore is really, really difficult with kind of, not just sort of permitting, but also technologically, the high seas are really difficult situations to work within. It is most likely that most, if not all, of the DAC hubs, given the time scale on which they're meant to roll out, will need to be stored, in or that the well sites will need to be terrestrial. That is, that's kind of my impression.
I agree with that. I think especially moving on this, as Selena stated before, this kind of like idea of a very rapid time scale, that's most likely what's going to happen. I do think that the person asking the question does mention mineralization potential. So I think what that terrestrial storage looks like has the opportunity to vary, especially as we see these new kind of startup companies like CarbFix in Iceland, who are mineralizing CO2 in Iceland right now from the Climeworks Orca plant. We're seeing opportunities for things like that to develop. And I think that some of the geology of the United States will lend itself to mineralization, as well as saline aquifer storage. I think from the conversations we've had with EJ communities, the storage of CO2 is a large concern because the science around it is really very much insulated in the science community. It's not something that we communicate with the general public. And so when you tell the general public, we're going to start storing CO2 underground, it kind of is like, whoa, hold on. Even though as scientists, we know that this is a very well understood mechanism, CO2 occurs naturally in these aquifers anyway. So I think that, the mineralization does have a real opportunity to be successful in a social context, because being able to say that we're turning this gas or this, super liquid into calcified rock, I think is a lot less scary than saying that we're storing this underground. So I think that the way that it could be differentiated between different types of terrestrial storage definitely is yet to be seen.
Yep, I agree. Next question. Citing industrial projects like this often get pushed to underserved communities because wealthier communities aggressively oppose them, right? We see that with oil refineries. As we empower underserved communities to advocate for their own community's needs, how are these policies to ensure that DAC projects get cited somewhere and aren't just opposed by everyone and never get built at all?
Yeah, so we have Justice 40, and the corollary to that is Fair Share 60, meaning that we need 60% or more of climate infrastructure to be cited in the communities that have benefited from climate action, from the development of solar and wind, say, but that have been able to resist because they have the power and they have the money, that citing in their communities. And that is really, really difficult right now. I think we're often sort of scared in the environmental movement to talk about project permitting, because often where those conversations lead is relaxing requirements for community consultation in the communities that have traditionally not been consulted and have not had real decision-making power. But I think there's a broader conversation here beyond just DAC to be able to figure out the kinds of legal mechanisms necessary in order to encourage, push those communities that have resisted infrastructure build out, that they then benefit from either locally, regionally, or globally, in order to take those on. And I agree that that is an area of this conversation that is kind of overlooked. And I'm sorry that I don't have a better answer for how we do that at this stage. We're hopeful that we can create kind of projects that do meet even sort of, wealthier community needs and that figure out ways to kind of plug into that. But the broader conversation that we need to be having, that we are not having, is how do we make sure that things get built quickly and they get built in the areas that have traditionally resisted for bad reasons, rather than for the reasons of being, traditionally having to bear the brunt of industrial build out.
Okay, anything to add, Simone? Okay, next question. How would you respond to critics or private sector partners who may ask whether communities know what's best for themselves and if they know enough about the issues to make decisions? Is it best for project developers to accept the first no they receive from communities surrounding the prospective site? Subsequently, what would community information sharing look like in this area to open up potential interest?
Yeah, I think that this is a good question that sort of builds a little bit off of the question that Selena just answered about, what happens if people say no, that DAC has to be cited somewhere. And I think part of it is a little bit of what I was getting at when I was saying that the information sharing, definitely, like in the word sharing, we have the insinuation of a two-way street. And I think a lot of times consultation with communities is not a two-way street. Just as you described earlier, Will, if you're already breaking ground and you're having a conversation with a community about what's happening, that's not a two-way street because you've already broken ground. So I think that the earlier you start to have conversations with community, the more that they can actually be conversations where there is a back and forth and maybe not just a no. I think that conversations often can involve education. As Selena was saying in the DFP polling, there were people in these communities that didn't know a lot about carbon capture or carbon dioxide removal, but were willing to learn and then form an opinion about it. And I think that that generally is the case with people are willing to learn a little bit about a topic and then help build out an opinion. But I think it all depends on the approach of the company. There is a really paternalistic view that a lot of companies have of, well, we know better because we're the developers. And that's what I was kind of talking about, of this expertise of science being held over the expertise of a community. It is very different to go into a community and say, this is going to be good for the climate, so it's going to be good for you. Can we build this project here? And saying, we recognize that there is a history in this community. We've done our research about it. We would like to ask you about, what benefits do you think your community could gain from a project like this? Or if a project like this were to come to your community, how would you like to see it develop? Or what ideas do you have for this? I think there's a lot of different ways to broach the conversation, but a lot of times businesses are focused on getting the project into the community and not so much willing to have a back and forth conversation that even might require education that I would argue most people are open to.
Okay. All right, great. Thanks for that. Next question. I imagine DAC is very energy intensive. It was highlighted in one of your maps that Louisiana was a good place for DAC. However, we do not have green power here. We just built a new natural gas plant in New Orleans, and a local parish just passed a moratorium on solar farms. What do we do in that case? What role does that consideration have to play in terms of the energy intensivity of these projects?
Yeah, definitely. So there are kind of two things here. First, do we cite DAC in places where we cannot build out renewable energy in order to support its energy intensiveness? And it is energy intensive. And the answer from at least, where we're standing is no, right? That like DAC needs to be powered either by, geothermal or wind or solar. And that in order to do that, because existing grids do not generally have excess power necessary to power a DAC hub, that needs to be built out on its own, in addition to the infrastructure of the DAC hub itself. And so I would say that, while those maps that I showed by Carbon 180 show where, some of these things overlap that Congress said are its priorities, that we're working on another mapping project that take some of these other priorities that we've communicated in this webinar of, renewable energy potential, not just sort of like where the wind blows or the sun shines, but also where there are local governance systems that would support the build out of additional renewable energy. And our hope is that there can be kind of overbuild scenarios where more renewable energy is built than even is required by the DAC hub, so that that is then fed into local grids and can continue to displace fossil fuel use.
Anything to add there, Simone? Okay, I think we have time for one more question. And this is one I think that we've touched a bit upon already, but maybe we can conclude with this. The question was, why is EOR even permitted instead of limiting captured CO2 to permanent storage in terms of these contemplated hubs?
My response to that would basically be kind of what I said earlier, that there isn't a mechanism for a price on carbon. And so EOR is permitted because, one, fossil industry has political power that is allowing for the legislation to develop in such a way that they advocate for this frequently so they can continue making a profit. And two, once again, in a capitalist market, we have to find a mechanism for pricing on everything. And they're allowed to use that because the price on oil is something that we know and understand. And so if the fossil energy sector are the incumbents that have the technology and capability and are doing most of this work already, they're going to do it to make a profit, and it's permitted because they have the profit and therefore the political power to advocate for it.
Yeah. How would you respond to the argument that's made sometimes by the fossil fuel industry that on balance, this EOR results in a net decline in CO2 production, right? Because instead of tapping unlimited virginal wells elsewhere, you do it here and at least some CO2 gets injected, right? And that some of the figures say that it reduces CO2 production by a third or even more. How would you respond to that argument?
Selena looks like she wants to take this one. So you looked excited, Selena.
Yeah, that it the LCA for the life cycle assessment for that works out in some cases. It does not work out universally. And also CO2 is not the only thing that we care about, right? We should be prioritizing CO2 alongside criteria pollutants that communities experience adverse health effects because of. And so, the perpetuation of fossil capital is problematic both for the emissions that it lets off, and we should be thinking kind of along multiple priorities if we're interested in climate justice, which I hope we are. And the other question that I kind of keep coming back to is, where do we want to be putting our political power? And if we are continuing to create support a fossil fuel economy, we are putting money into the actors that have not just historically, like several decades ago, but last year admitted that they go to Congress members and fight for climate action to be reduced or brushed under the carpet. And so it's a question also of sort of the political economy of these issues, as well as the life cycle assessment of the thing itself, and where I think we should have multiple priorities rather than just one.
All right, thank you for that. It's a fascinating issue and an ongoing issue, as are all of these, right? These considerations now are front and center in a lot of funding proposals, right? Frontier always asks about environmental justice considerations of projects they might fund, the X Prize, private investment funds increasingly. So this is an ongoing sort of issue, and I think this was really helpful in fleshing out some of those issues as we move forward. So once again, I'd like to thank Selena and Simone for joining us in what I think was a great first episode of Scrubbing the Skies. I thank you everyone that joined us. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions. We will archive them and send them to Selena and Simone if they want to pick any of those up thereafter. And I hope all of you will join us for our future episodes, which we will announce the next couple of ones very soon. So have a great rest of the day or evening, wherever you may be. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye now.